before you watch this video, I just want to say, or should I say not video, but before you hear this audio of one of these radio interviews I've done, I want to say I had a lot of miscommunications in this interview from the co-host and a couple from the actual host. There was a few things said that were not true, or things that I never said that were added on to this story that they said, and there was a lot of questions that the basically the co-host bashed me the whole time. I basically want to share this with you guys because it's better to come from me than you go on their page and then hear a bunch of stuff that most of you already know my story. So the worst thing to do is go on their page, look at it, and say, wait, this doesn't sound like his experience. He didn't say this in this experience. Every radio talk or podcast I've done, my story always adds up, and I always say the same thing. So in this case, there were a few things that were said that were not exactly what I said, and a few words that were twisted in things that I actually said, they completely twisted around. So what I did, I took notes of every single time frame that mistakes were made in this audio. I talked to the host. He said he removed those things, but basically you do the math, it's around the same time. But I'm still putting the original time marks because I don't know if his new video is up yet or whatever, but I'm getting it clear with you. I want you guys to be clear that, I'm just basically correcting some of the mistakes they made. So, love y'all, no bad vibes, enjoy the video.
Listener discretion is advised for this episode, as there will be discussion of self-harm and suicide. If you are feeling suicidal, we ask you to reach out to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255 or online at suicidepreventionlifeline.org. My brother and I have always been intrigued by the unexplainable. Like many, we're fascinated with stories of the supernatural, fringe science, and modern-day mysteries.
Though we've seen no first-hand proof of its existence, our minds remain open to the possibility.
Unsatisfied with the so-called evidence on television and the internet, we are choosing to take matters into our own hands and conduct our own interviews and research.
Now we're on a quest to speak with as many people as we can and hear the stories of these events from those who have lived them.
No Hollywood effects or exaggerations, and no hidden agenda. We invite you to listen and decide what and who you believe.
We are the Brothers Mysterium.
Hello and welcome to the Brothers Mysterium. My name is Tommy. My brother is Eric. Hey, no, he is not here today. Don't worry, I found a co-host to fill in. And speaking of fill in, why don't I fill you in on how you can help us? You can do so by rating and reviewing this podcast on whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're at it, give us a follow at Mysterium Bros on Twitter and Instagram, or head on over to facebook.com/The Brothers Mysterium and give us a like. So filling in for my brother Eric is none other than Christine. Christine, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And I should actually say welcome back to the show, because you were actually featured on episode 16, Technology and the Paranormal. Go check that out if someone out there has not yet heard it. But now you've made the jump to co-host, so congrats.
I'm moving up, huh?
You are moving on up in the world. So just for those people who might not know you or be familiar with that episode, briefly, could you just talk about if you are indeed open to the paranormal, the supernatural?
Sure. So I guess let's start with just saying that I'm a scientist. So as much as I love the idea of the paranormal, I also love facts, which are kind of hard to come across when you're talking about the supernatural or paranormal. So I am open to it for sure, and I feel like I've been investigating it my entire life, and I keep finding new information, but I wouldn't say that I am sold, but I am definitely open. Let's say that.
Yes, that's basically the reason this show exists. The constant hunt for some sort of proof, which might never happen, but it's fun to explore.
Exactly.
Just so we know, have you ever had a near-death experience, or do you know anyone personally who's had one?
I'm trying to think. I don't believe, I know I definitely never had a near-death experience. I have had an out-of-body experience, I would say, once. That's the only thing I could recall. But I don't know anyone personally that had a near-death experience, and I did not have one either.
Fair enough. Me neither. And then our final question, not to hit you with a super heavy question, but being of science, that mind frame, and with just your own beliefs, what do you think happens when we die?
This is the question. This is my life search, is trying to figure out what happens. I don't know, but what I think I want to believe, I guess, is that there's more to it. Like, for me, this life that we're living here is kind of just a test and a way that we can jump up spiritually. I don't believe it just ends. And if it does, I'd rather just pretend that it doesn't, because that makes it easier for me anyway.
Yeah.
So I'm all about thinking that there is more to this. I do believe in reincarnation and that sort of thing. So definitely more than just this.
Yeah, makes sense, and not an easy question to answer. So appreciate you stepping up to the plate.
Mm-hmm.
And then a cool thing about our show, obviously, is it's a safe, judgment-free place for people to share their stories. So we already did 2 near-death experience episodes, and that's when somebody reached out to us with their story. They wanted to come on, share it. And I guess that, I've said it before, it's kind of a cool byproduct, because the show was made basically for me and Eric to explore our search into the paranormal, but other people hear it, it opens their eyes, they hear of experiences they had, and they say, oh, I'm not alone, I never knew that had a name. So that's sort of what happened in this instance, where after hearing our 2 episodes on near-death experiences, it is now going to be a trilogy, because one young man heard us and decided he wanted to share his story.
The Brothers Mysterium.
My name is Chris Batch, and I'm from Southern California.
And as you can probably guess, Chris had an NDE. But what makes his different than that of our previous 2 guests is that Chris's near-death experience was the result of suicide. Can you kind of give us a brief history of your life leading up to your near-death experience?
Sure. When I was 6 months old, my mom threw me in a local neighborhood dumpster.
Shockingly and sadly, you did hear that correct. At just 6 months old, Chris's mother abandoned him by leaving him in a local dumpster.
I think that was basically the root of all the depression I had over the years.
Parental abandonment, such as what Chris experienced, can lead to psychological trauma in a young child. Often, that child will grow up grappling with strong emotions related to grief, anger, a lack of self-esteem, and depression, due to knowing their parents did not want them. This depression and underlying feeling of being unloved or unlovable would become a major struggle throughout Chris's life. After being in the dumpster for a few hours, a neighbor spotted Chris and quickly got him out and brought him into her home.
And the neighbor recognized who I was. And she said, oh my goodness, I know this kid's mother, but my mom wasn't anywhere to be found. So the person called my grandma, and my grandma was at church. So my grandma dropped everything she was doing at church to come home and pick me up from the neighbor's house. So after that, my grandma hasn't heard from my mother in months. So my grandma she was taking care of me.
At this point, Chris's grandmother was now raising him, and she wanted to make things official and become his legal guardian.
My grandma went to fight for custody of me at court. The judge told my mom she could never ever have me ever again.
With his mother out of the picture, life improved, and Chris was happy living with his grandmother, until things took an unexpected turn when Chris was just 4 years old.
When I turned 4, my grandma had a nervous breakdown.
Following her nervous breakdown, Chris's grandmother wound up in hospice for a year.
I then started staying with her daughter.
So Chris goes and lives with his aunt. But she and her husband already have 4 children of their own, and their home is anything but welcoming.
They pretty much took me in because I was getting some type of disability when I was a little kid for epilepsy and seizures. And they only took me in for that money. At the age of 4, I told myself, I'm going to raise myself, grow up, and teach myself how to grow up. Because the people at the house I was living with, I couldn't look up. They were mean to me. I didn't eat sometimes, and then I didn't clothes when it was cold outside. They treated me really bad, but then they gave their kid, everything in the world.
Life with his aunt and uncle is terrible, as they neglect Chris and are straight up mean to him. Their emotional abuse and his own feelings of being unwanted and unloved lead to feelings of despair and depression.
So I was very depressed.
As Chris grows up, he becomes more and more consumed by his depression, and 4 years later, he begins self-injury or cutting.
So when I was 8, I tried to cut myself for the first time. I went into the bathroom, I snuck a knife into the bathroom, I took it out, and I just, slit my wrist, and obviously I'm still here, so it didn't work. So up until I still had these feelings, and I was moving around to about maybe 4 other homes as a child because I wasn't happy at any of them.
Non-suicidal self-injury, often simply called self-injury, is the act of deliberately harming your own body, such as cutting or burning yourself. It's typically not meant as a suicide attempt, but rather, this type of self-injury is a harmful way to cope with emotional pain, intense anger, and frustration. While self-injury may bring a momentary sense of calm and a release of tension, it's usually followed by guilt and shame and the return of the painful emotions. While slitting one's wrists can be an attempt at ending their own life, it is also common for people to do so in an attempt to gain attention as a cry for help.
After a few homes I went to, it was about, high school? That's when the depression went away, because I was, very, very popular.
In high school, Chris is finally able to escape his depression and a tough life of being bounced from home to home. He has friends, a purpose, and is enjoying life again for the first time in a long time.
So after high school was over, I was in the work field. I was just pretty much alone. I didn't have as many friends as I did before because of, the work world, and then everybody goes their own separate ways after high school. So it was just basically me and myself and I, but I've always felt that's how it's always been.
With the end of high school, Chris slowly slips back into his depression as he finds himself alone more often than not.
I started 18 to maybe 22. I was doing all types of drugs and drinking all day, every day, because I wanted to, not have that feeling of depression. I felt rejected. I felt unwanted. And I would always think, how come my mom didn't want me when I was a baby? But then it's not even just that. It was more, how come my mom doesn't want me? I had friends that weren't exactly good friends to me, but I was good friends to them. And then I dated girls who were not as good to me as I was to them. So it seemed like all around, I was getting the short end of the stick. Yeah, so that's what mainly was what caused a lot of suicidal thoughts. I felt alone.
Relying on drugs and alcohol to cope with his loneliness, his depression, and the pain of his mother abandoning him lead Chris to begin to form a plan to take his own life.
I was like maybe 23, 22 at this time. I started planning a suicide. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna jump in the middle of a train, and I would look at the trains and what it came, and so I timed it right. So I said, what I'm gonna do is just step inside this train track and just sit here and get hit. I happened to be arguing with a friend of mine when I was at their house one day. And I told them, I said, you know what? I've been suicidal. I'm just going to go do it. I'm going to get this over with. And I just left the house. So as I started walking a while, like a few blocks away, I see their car behind me. And they're like,
get in the car. Get in the car.
And so I got in, and my thoughts are like, man, what am I going to do now? Like, I got to come up with a new plan. Ironically, because I haven't seen my mom very much, only a few times when I was little, very few times. I've never seen my dad before. But the thing with my mom, this day, as I'm in my friend's car, in the passenger side, my mom calls me, out of all people. And out of all people, and she says, I'm like, how did you even get my number? Like, it's been so long. How did you even know how to call me? She says,
I got your number from your grandma.
I think she wants to apologize to me and express her regret. So I'm thinking that's what she's going to call me for. I was going to give her the benefit of the doubt. And me having suicidal thoughts all this time, I'm like, maybe this call, maybe she just may be the one to talk me out of the suicide. But she tells me,
just want to let you know, I'm not your mother. Don't claim me as your mom. I never wanted you. I never will want you. You mean nothing to me.
I'm like, oh, you called me to tell me that. Okay, you told me that when I was 6 months old, you know?
Yeah.
So, as I'm in my friend's car, that's not the type of thing you tell someone who's already planning their suicide as it is. So, she said,
I'm not your mom.
And I said, well, F you never were. And I had rolled down the window and tossed out the phone. And I looked at my friend in the driver's seat, and I said, F this. Jumped out the car.
Wow.
I ended up hitting the back of my head on the concrete. That's all I remember. My front of my face was pretty messed up too, but I don't remember how that happened. And I just remember that boom sound when the back of my head hit the concrete. So after that, I guess I black out, and I'm thinking like, let me get up, because I just thought I fell. I said, I'm just going to keep pushing myself. So I pushed myself, boom, and then I'm outside of my body. How I know I'm outside of my body? Because I look down, and I see my body laying down, and I'm standing right next to it.
Chris is now in what is a very common start to a near-death experience, having a perception of separation from one's own body, also known as an out-of-body experience. As he stands above his body, which is sprawled out on the road, he is suddenly transported and finds himself in a vast and featureless void.
I'm in a void after that, and it's like, I'm nowhere, I'm just in a void. And that's when I felt God's presence, or God's source. People have so many names for God, I just call him source. I felt that strong, dominant presence, like the strongest male in the world, the strongest alpha male, but you got like the love of the most loving woman in the world too. Telepathically, I had a bunch of thoughts and a bunch of questions, and they were all answered before I even asked them. I mean, first comment was like, I want to reintroduce myself to you. I am God. Yes, I am real. Yes, angels are real. They're a gift from me. Want to meet them?
When God, or the Source, or this Supreme Being, whatever name you choose to assign to it, asks Chris if he wants to meet his angels, Chris has a simple, one-word reply: no.
I did not believe in guardian. I didn't even believe in angels at that time. I didn't believe any of that stuff was real. And I just knew I wanted to leave Earth. That's all I knew.
For more context, let's go back in time and touch on Chris's religious upbringing to give us a better sense of his thoughts and feelings towards God and angels.
When I was a little kid, we went to church Mondays and Wednesdays and Saturdays, and we always went to church, but the way they treated us, or should I say me, was very, mean. So I had a certain opinion about religion growing up. I would always think, if God is really like me, why am I going to, care? I don't want to worship a God that's just beat me every chance he can get.
Right.
Yeah, that's what they use, the scare tactics, like you're gonna burn in a burning place called hell for eternity if you don't basically do what I say. That's what we were taught.
So Chris grew up with some Catholic guilt and the image of a mean, vengeful God. With such a tough life, it's understandable Chris would question if God really exists. And if he does, just as understandable that Chris wouldn't exactly be a big fan of his work. Well, now Chris finds himself face to face with that entity.
After that, he tells me, or here's it, the spirit tells me, I love you. I love everybody. I will go to the end of the world so everyone is with me. Then I said, well, how am I supposed to tell people, about your character? What am I supposed to do? I got to go get perfect. And he's like, no, love you how you are. So my thought was, well, I told him, I said, what am I supposed to tell people when I go back to Earth so they don't think I'm crazy? And he says, go tell everyone that I love them. So then I felt him drop and give me the biggest hug. And I didn't want that hug to be, I didn't want him to let go. I felt safe. And I just felt love. I didn't feel any judgment at all.
Chris is enveloped in the hug and feels more love and peace than he has ever known in life. Next, an object is brought forward, a large screen.
Like projector screen.
Like a movie screen. And on that screen are scenes of average, everyday people just walking around, including a man.
In a business suit, in a briefcase, he's walking by. Then, God says, okay, I love him. So then I see, this prostitute girl. And, she's walking by. He says, I love her. Then you see this, skateboarder guy walking with a big joint in his, in his mouth, and God's like, I love him. I love everybody the same way. So after that, I said, okay, well, is there anything else that you want me to say? He's just well, tell everyone I love them. That's it. So, basically, I took that as, tell as many people as you can that I love them. After that, he says, I love you. And he says, you're special. You have a lot to do. So then, that's when literally I'm up in the air now. And I'm where the clouds are in the sky.
Chris is again quickly teleported to a new location, this time out of the nondescript void and into the heavens. That being, he is literally floating in the sky amongst the clouds. But clouds aren't the only other objects up there with him. All around Chris are angels.
but there was a bunch of angels actually around me. But there was two in particular that seemed so familiar. And I knew they were familiar. I've seen them before, and I know I have. It was like one of those looks like, oh my God.
These two angels stuck out to Chris, and he immediately recognized them. He had that distinct feeling. He had met them somewhere before, or somehow he already knew them. And were they like people? Did they look like they were, did they have halos? Did they have wings? Could you kind of describe these angels?
Of course. So all the angels that were ground, like in a circle, they were gathered. I didn't really pay much attention to them, but these main two, there was one on each side, one on my right, one on my left. Those two, I paid attention to everything. The one on my left side had long wings, like his wings were really wide, and he didn't have a halo, but it was more like a beetle type of creature, and like a beetle type of creature. The wings are about maybe 5 feet, and his height is 9 feet tall.
Okay.
They're both men. They're both males. The one on my right side was like very human. He had a human face. He had curly hair. He had on blue jeans. He had on a red flannel shirt, and the sleeves were rolled up to the elbows. And he was really buff, like really, really buff.
Phone reception got bad there, so it was a little choppy. So just to summarize so that we're all on the same page. The first angel, the one on Chris's left, had no halo and was a beetle-like creature with wide 5-foot-long wings and stood 9 feet tall. Conversely, the angel on the right was more humanoid and more along the lines of a bounty paper towel type angel. He had curly hair, blue jeans, a red flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbow, and he was really, really buff. And this pair of angels had a question for Chris.
They told me, do you want to go or stay? Like right away, I told them, okay, I'll go back. The one on my left-hand side was more stern. And he's like, are you sure you want to go? Like with a stern voice. And I looked over to the right side, and that's when the angel on my right side was just more caring and compassionate. And I'm thinking he's going to like kill me or something, but he was so compassionate and caring and understanding. And he just looks at me and says, you have so much to do for so many people. And I'm like, what? I do? Like, what am I supposed to do for people? I didn't get it at the time. They say you should go back to Earth. There's going to be a lot of things you're going to see. A lot of things are going to change. And you need to be there. You need to love people. You need to love people. So I said, you need to look at your body too. And they said, and I said, so you mean to tell me this stuff does happen? They said, yes, look down. So I looked down, and I see the paramedics over my body. And I saw the friend was in the driver's seat. She was right there. Like she was on the side, though, off to the side on her phone. They zoomed in like a camera, and sure enough, there was the same thing as my body. There was paramedics around me. I said, oh my God, I'm looking at my body. And they said, you need to love people. You're going to be just love. That's what it's about. That's what it's about, love. They told me, do you want to go or stay? I said, I think I'm going to go and try to help people. Well, they said, well, that's the best thing to do is go back and help people. So I told myself, okay, you know what? I love you guys. I thank you guys. I'm going to go back to Earth. Literally a couple seconds later, I guess I'm inside my body. I don't know like exactly how fast it was, but I just know I woke up a few days later in the hospital from a coma. And the nurses were calling me miracle, saying that I had hemorrhaged out of I don't know how many bags.
Chris had sustained multiple injuries, severe head trauma, and lost a lot of blood. He was in a coma, and it was assumed he would not survive. Interestingly, upon regaining consciousness, and in the following days at the hospital, when it came to his NDE and his meeting with God and the angels,
I didn't remember anything. when I was being wheelchaired out.
Okay.
I looked up at the sky, and I saw how the sky was clear and the horizon looked, everything was beautiful. So I was saying, so, oh my gosh, something happened. And that's when I looked at the sky. I'm like, something happened to me. I didn't know what it was, but I just knew something happened to me.
So upon being discharged from the hospital and staring blankly up at the beautiful sky, suddenly a flood of memories hit Chris, and he can recall everything from his near-death experience. And the two angels Chris had met on the other side weren't exactly finished speaking with him.
I was trying to heal from my experience, like my body. I didn't have a smell, I didn't have taste, I couldn't like really stand up or anything like that. And if I tried to talk, my words would get, like my tongue would get stuck to my mouth. I couldn't really talk much. So after leaving the hospital, I really didn't go back for treatment. I just basically tried to self-heal. Oh, and one day I was taking a shower. This was maybe a couple months after my experience. So my balance was a little bit better, and that's when I heard one of the angels and he like, we're your guardian angels. Remember us? And I'm like, oh man, like I do remember you guys. And he said, we need you to empty your mind. We're going to teach you. You need to know. I didn't really know what that meant, but as far as the first thing I remember them teaching me was your brain controls everything. The reason you can't walk, you can't really talk right now is because your brain is messed up. Your brain controls everything. Like your brain is basically the control panel for your whole body. They talk telepathically. And to this day, they still have a relationship with me. They taught me my energy centers, like my chakras. They told me to go, at first they told me to go on the internet when I was still in the healing process. They were telling me go on the internet and look up people that have died like you and came back. So that's when I seen, oh my gosh, like that's called a near-death experience. I had a near-death experience.
So you never saw them, you just hear them kind of telepathically.
I don't see them anymore. Right. But I just hear them and feel them all the time. I feel their emotion and know which one is saying what.
These angels helped Chris learn to speak and walk again, and began teaching him about life, love, relationships, the 7 chakras, and they continue speaking with him to this day.
The Brothers Mysterium.
And as always, I had a few follow-up questions for Chris. And just out of curiosity, do you know how fast the car was going when you jumped out of it?
I was asked that question before, but I really wasn't paying attention because all I know is my friend turned and made a right turn, and that's when I opened the door and jumped out. Right.
And then you kind of said when you came out of the coma, you're leaving the hospital, looking at the sky, you really didn't even remember your near-death experience until, was it like that moment when suddenly the memories came back to you and you're like, oh, damn, I went through that?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
When you were sort of in this NDE state, there are some commonalities. Did you happen to see a tunnel or travel down like a tunnel of light at any point? I know you said you were in a void.
Yeah, when I was in the sky, there was this, and I'm so sorry I didn't even mention this. There was a white cloud, and you seen a hole right in it. If I were to have stepped into that cloud, I wouldn't have came back.
Oh,
that's what my angels were trying to convince me. Like, don't go back. Don't go through this thing right now. Like, don't go through yet. We got something to tell you, and then you can decide if you want to go through or not.
Right. Very, very cool. That was the gateway to the other side. A lot of people say that they saw deceased relatives. It sounds like you did not see any of your deceased relatives.
I did not see any deceased relatives.
And then another commonality, a lot of people say they have a life review where spirits or an angel will sort of give them a recap of their life. I know you did say there was the screen where you saw kind of random people going by and the source saying, I love him, I love her. Right. Did you see any sort of life review or life recap?
No, if I would have went into that circle, I think I would have seen life review, and I would have met my, past relatives and past people that I've known. But I didn't put my foot inside of that circle.
Right. You mentioned the source and that feeling of peace and love and being hugged. Could you just talk a little bit more about what it was like to be in the presence and how hard of a decision it is to come back? Because a lot of people say they've finally escaped the world. It's beautiful here. They wouldn't want to come back to the real world.
But they do, yeah. I was like that before. But the thing was, it was so much love, and you're not a robot. They left the decision up to you, so you can go back if you want or not. You don't have to. My thing was, at that very moment, and as fast as it was happening, the urgency for me to go back was very strong. Mm. So I felt it, said, you know what, there was no thinking about it. I told them, okay, I'll go back. Like right away, I told them, okay, go back.
Every time we do an episode like this, there are those people that say, this didn't really happen, it was a hallucination, you hit your head, you had a brain injury, you even said people tell you it's not real. What do you say to those people that kind of doubt you or say it's sort of a medical thing, it didn't really happen?
I actually hear this, I've heard this a lot of times, and I say the same thing. I say I've doubted myself even like when it first happened, but me looking down at my body was the clarification that this stuff really does happen. Yeah. Like literally when I'm myself and I'm literally looking down at the concrete and I'm looking at my body laid out on the ground and I see paramedics over me, they're declaring me dead. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, that's where the doubt goes away. I'm like, oh yeah, I did see my body. That was not a hallucination.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And then, I mean, obviously it did change your life. I know that you said it's almost one of the best things that ever happened to you was having a near-death experience. Could you talk a little bit about your book and about how suicide prevention is now a driving force in your life?
Okay, well, my book is actually a testimony in a way, because I know the mind of a suicidal person because I was there. So it's like, now that this has happened to me, I find it really important to spread love and to reassure people that they are loved.
Right, that's a great cause.
Yeah, so it's mainly the reason I even wrote this book. I wanted to explain my life story and say, you know what, I've been through things too. I've been where you are. This is how my life was since I was a kid. You guys may have some things that happened to you bad, but listen to my story. You'll hear it's probably a little bit worse, you know? Yeah. But, yeah, it's like, so, and if I made it through this, so can you. And at the same time, I want to reach people who are scared of death and people that have questions about religion. And I feel like I'm so lucky because I find out the truth on my own. And if that never happened to me, I don't know if I would have had anybody that would have been that positive force, right, a positive person that might just be able to talk me out of a suicide. I just want people out there to know that the people that have questions about religion, I want them to tell them that you're loved. Trust me, like, you're loved. Either way it goes, you're loved. And for someone that's suicidal, tell someone, and there is always someone that you may be able to talk to. And that was my problem. I didn't speak out about my suicidal thoughts much. I think it's important for people to actually speak out about them to people that they will be able to confide in. There has to be one person out there you can confide in.
So we want to thank Chris for choosing to share his story on our platform and for his openness and honesty. And also just want to applaud him for now his work in trying to help others with depression and suicidal thoughts. So we commend him. And now let's kind of break down his story a little bit. Obviously a very tough life, terrible relationship with his mother. He was happy for a little bit in high school, but basically the crescendo of his story is, which I thought was like, if it was a movie, it's this moment where he decides life's not worth living. I'm going to go jump on the train tracks. As he is walking there, his friend stops him, and instead of being like, oh, wow, I don't have to go through with it, he's more angry, and he's like, well, she ruined my plan. How am I going to kill myself now? And then out of nowhere, out of all the people in the whole world, his mother calls him. He doesn't talk to her, doesn't like her. They have no relationship. He doesn't even know that she has his number. And part of me is like, if this was a movie right now, she would say, I did wrong by you. I'm here. I want redemption. Let's start a relationship. That does not happen. She basically is very cold-hearted and I'll say just evil to him, to the point where this moment that just kind of, I don't know, people talk about coincidences and synergy and things being kismet, and it's like, could have worked out in a beautiful way, but instead it went the exact opposite way. The lowest moment of his life, the worst person possible calls him and sort of kicks him while he's down, and that's when he decides to just end it, jumps out of the car, hits his head, and enters his near-death experience. So, a wild story right off the bat, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I actually had the same thought as you when he said that his mom was calling. I immediately was thinking, I'm in Disney mode. Oh, how sweet, she's going to save his life right now.
Exactly.
That's exactly what I was thinking. And then, no, not so much. Kind of poured some salt in the wound.
Yeah, he was literally on the edge, and instead of pulling him back, where I'm like, wow, she called you, that's crazy. What are the chances? But instead of pulling him back from the edge, she just shoved him over it.
Yeah, that was a push.
And the first interesting thing is he enters an out-of-body experience, which is very common with near-death experiences where he's trying to sit up, he's on the road, he's pushing, he finally does, he stands up, he looks down, and he sees himself on the road, which blows his mind. And he actually has 2 out-of-body experiences in this story. We'll get to the second one. It's a bit later when he's kind of up in the sky with the angels. But I thought it was interesting that he starts out with sort of a classic NDE characteristic, and then later he kind of comes off the trail from it. Do you have anything you want to throw out as far as the very start of his journey?
I'm just wondering, did you ever ask him, or did he ever reveal whether he was actually pronounced dead at the scene, or was he still, maybe he never even told you, but I'm just curious if he was actually, when you have an NDE, a lot of times the patients were pronounced dead for a certain period of time and then they come to.
Right.
Did he say anything about that?
He did not say anything about laying there on the street. I know when he got to the hospital, he was dead for a bit, and then they were able to bring him back, and that's where he was hemorrhaging massive amounts of blood. So I did ask Chris, and he said he never did get to look at the paperwork or any medical forms closely, but the nurse told him after hemorrhaging a lot of blood, he died before slipping into a coma. Meaning, clearly, it was not a medically induced coma. Another interesting thing, he kind of skips the tunnel of light, the classic move to the light moment, and in his experience, he's standing above his body, and then boom, suddenly he's just in a void. Featureless, shapeless nothingness, which is creepy, I would say.
It reminds me of also when it's kind of more of a negative, not that the whole experience is negative, but just that initial negative moment where I feel like a lot of the stories that I've read about, it's almost immediately positive.
Right.
The ones that talk about it anyway, it's like that bright light and you feel so great and everything's wonderful for him. Like, if I was just in a void, I would be very anxious and kind of on edge. I don't know that I'd feel good about it.
Yeah, it's definitely alarming to first realize you're standing above your body and then in an instant you are just literally nowhere.
Right.
And that's when he has beings of light are very common with near-death experiences. He said he couldn't really describe this source, he called it God, we could say. Very interesting description. He says it's like the strong alpha male father presence, but also the most feminine, loving, nurturing, caring vibe in the world. And it kind of reminded me of Howard Storm's interaction with God, as Howard called it, where he just has that overwhelming feeling of peace, of love, of acceptance, and then he gets a big warm hug. And I thought that was pretty cool. And again, that is a classic NDE, is that feeling of just pure serenity.
Right. Do you often find in these stories that this is a God that they're seeing, or is it usually just more spirits? Like, the fact that he called it God initially, for me, when I'm reading about these stories and things like that, the first thing that most people talk about are they feel that their spirit's with them. But they don't jump straight to, like, God is here, it's God right here. So that was a little bit surprising to me that was the first experience that he had. It wasn't like someone led him to God. It was God first, and then that moved into bringing him to the angels. Did you notice that?
I did. And I always wonder too, like he had mentioned at one point he used, as a kid, would go to church all the time, and he didn't like God because it was that classic
Right.
mean God. But I wonder if it's just people's, like, the only terminology they know is like, okay, this presence must be God, must be this. So it's almost like, how are they trying to interpret what they're experiencing as well? Like, would someone else have said, this creature then led me to these other two, and maybe like one of the angels was God? But it's,
Right.
I guess that's sort of the human element. That's his experience. We can only guess. But to your point, it is interesting that, yeah, there was no build up. There was nothing. It was like God was the first one to welcome him there, which that's kind of rare.
Right. Also, like you say, the terminology, we only know what we know in this life and in this environment. So, like, if there's some kind of being that doesn't exist in our physical life, there's no way for us to really put a term to it. So you're right. It makes sense that you would just kind of give it that name.
Yeah, it's probably hard to describe something that you can't describe. So God is sort of a catch-all. Like, I was kind of impressed he said, or the source. Because it's like, okay, because someone else would have just said, nope, God.
Yeah, I like the source almost better than God, because that more describes it rather than gives it a name.
Right. And then even when you say God, then some people might say, oh, yes, loving God. Somebody else might say, that vengeful, evil God. So even the word God has a lot of
it's all
personal,
going to be particular to that person.
Right, as where the source of everything is a little more open, which is cool.
Mm-hmm.
Much like Howard as well, he almost immediately starts this telepathic conversation where God is reading his mind and just starts answering questions, which I thought was also interesting. Just once again, a commonality in these near-death experiences.
Yeah, like you don't have to say anything. You just think it and they understand.
Right. Once again, you're just hit with these answers to questions you have not even asked.
I don't know if you caught this either, the one thing that he said, I'm sure you did catch it, obviously. The one thing that he said, or God, his source or God said immediately was, I'm here and I'm real. And that was kind of I don't know, I mean, imagine you are in this void and then you're presented with this figure or whatever you want to call it. And the first thing they say to you is, I'm real. You're like, well, what the hell? I don't know. For me, I'd be like, what? No, you're not. You're literally a figment of my imagination. So that was kind of weird, too, that he just straight out started with, hi, I'm God and I'm real.
Yeah, a little bit of a strong lead. Might be a little bit of a desperate God trying to convince him. I guess we could say, due to his religious upbringing and his doubts, maybe God was trying to like reassure him and be like, hey, this is real, I'm real, it's all happening. But yeah. It is definitely sort of a very forward, hi, how you doing? I'm God, I'm real, and welcome to the netherworld.
Exactly.
What I thought was the most interesting was, again, their beings of light have been discussed and everything, but he said he saw angels, and not only are they angels, he says one is a beetle-looking creature, which I've never really heard of before, and the other one, I said, is like a brawny paper towel guy. He's sort of got a lumberjack vibe, where he's just a good-looking dude in a flannel shirt. He's super buff. They're not beings of light, and that is very uncharacteristic of near-death experiences and just angel descriptions in general.
Right. It almost felt like a hallucination or something when your brain just kind of creates a being from the things that you know.
Right.
But I mean, it also reminded me a little bit of Angel Devil on the Shoulder, because he did say the beetle character was more stern, and then the other one was like a little bit more compassionate, and you felt, there was definitely like a balance to having both of them there. I think that was something that was almost meant to happen, to have both ends.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was wondering sort of two things. One is, did they come to him in these forms only because, like, he had a hard time describing God, it's the source, this entity, so were they like, well, he knows what a beetle is, and he knows what a good-looking dude in a flannel shirt is, so is that not their natural form? Did they just sort of present themselves in that way? Was it a beetle, as in the insect? Was it like a 9-foot-tall John Lennon beetle, perhaps? Are they maybe just pulling images more recognizable, more comfortable for him to be in front of, to see, to speak with? I'm not really sure.
I believe that. I think that there's not a physical, like when you move into the soul and the spirit, I don't believe that there's like a physical appearance that's associated with it.
Right.
So it's more that your mind has to put a physical appearance to it, because in this world, that's what we look at each other and we see. But there, it's more about feeling the energy.
Right.
So I
exactly.
think maybe your brain, just to tie it to something, maybe creates this picture of what you believe it would be. But I don't know that, like, there's really, I mean, for myself, when I'm thinking of the spirit world, I don't believe that there's 9 feet Beatles, you know, walking around up there. Like, that's not something that's ever popped into my head.
Yeah. And the second thing that I kind of like about it is that it is so weird and specific that it almost makes it a little bit more credible. Like if he said, oh, they were both blonde with harps and they were you know, floating around me, then I'd say, well, that's a little too perfect, a little too cliche. So the fact that it is so weird, you know, I always like to be like, well, that could maybe be something because it is so outlandish and uncommon.
Exactly.
One major thing that struck me was, obviously, he said he had this Catholic guilt upbringing, and suicide is a big no-no. You're sort of throwing away God's greatest gift, the gift of life. And from what I recall, you're punished for that. If you commit suicide, you go to hell, you burn forever. He did not have a negative experience at all. He was in that void for a second, which we talked about could be definitely creepy and unnerving. But as far as any sort of punishment, like even Howard Storm, who admitted he was a butthole in life, went to hell at first and then was kind of pulled up, and it taught him a lesson. But he was never really punished. There was no negative repercussions. They told him, you know, don't do this, that you have more to offer, you should keep living. And an interesting thing, Kenneth Ring, who's a professor of psychology at the University of Connecticut and does a ton of NDE research, he's actually also the co-founder and a past president of the International Association of Near-Death Studies, IANDS for short, if you're wondering, and he is the founding editor of the Journal of Near-Death Studies. But he found that suicides do not lead to more often unpleasant NDEs than unintended near-death experiences. So in his research, would contradict what I thought, which was suicide is bad, you'll be punished. But he's saying from his research, other suicide survivors have said, no, it was pleasant, it was nice. I saw God, I went to heaven, it was good. So that's just an unexpected turn for me.
I wonder, though, like if it's an attempted suicide versus a successful suicide. So, I mean, obviously we don't have the story of a successful suicide. Are they punished? I don't know. But I mean, if they're choosing to come back and they're choosing to now perhaps change their life and turn things around and help others, then they're given that second chance.
Right.
So maybe because of that, that's why they're met with this positive experience, because then it's kind of encouraging them to go back and do it. Whereas maybe the ones that don't come back, they, like I said, who knows what happens after that.
Right, yeah. And that's interesting, too, that they didn't try to do the scared straight method of saying, hey, you're an idiot. If you try this again, you're going to burn in a lake of fire forever. You know, they didn't try to scare him out of another future suicide attempt. They were definitely more loving and positive and were telling him, you know, they're motivating him. You can do more. Your life is worth it. You're going to touch people. You're going to influence people. So, and obviously, as you said, we will never know what a successful suicide person experienced. Another thing that was missing, which was very common in every other NDE that I've come upon, is the life review. He did not have one at all, which I found just an interesting anomaly.
That whole section of his story was a little strange to me, that we had the screen and I was getting set up for the life review.
Yeah.
Okay, we're ready for this. And then
you had the popcorn out.
Random people walking around. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
It also didn't have like enough weight, I would say, almost. It wasn't as impactful as, look what you did. You know, you were wrong here, you were right here. And then you gain this perspective of, oh my God, what kind of life was I living? It was more just like, I love that dude. I love that random person. Almost like stock images or like clips from a commercial. Yeah. Or here's a skateboarder smoking weed. I love him. Here's a classic dude in a business suit. He's cool too.
See, and that was a little strange to me, because I would think if they wanted to prove a point, and I'm just being the skeptic right now, of course, but if they wanted to prove a point up there, wouldn't they either bring someone that he personally knew, or, someone, because if you just point to a random person on the street, it's like, whoever, I don't even know who that person is, it doesn't tie in as well as if you could tie it to, like, someone you personally had, I don't know, some kind of an experience with.
Yeah, I feel like that was definitely probably the biggest missing one of the commonalities, is that impactful life review, because that's usually what flips the switch from I'm a bad person, I'll be a good person, or even just, I was okay at life, but I could be better. I should be nicer. I should be kinder. His was just sort of the message of God, the source, saying, I love everybody. Go back, tell everybody I love them, I love you. But I mean, I guess, who are we to judge? Because I guess it worked in Chris's case.
Yeah, he needed to just know that he had to spread the word, that God wanted him to tell everyone that he loved him. So, I mean, I guess that's the point that was trying to come across.
Yeah, that seems to be it. And then the other commonality that I just found very interesting was, usually, from what we heard on the 2 episodes we did on the show and from researching, people usually will kind of wake up and be like, wow, that was crazy. But I guess maybe because he was in a coma following his injury, it was like days later, Chris wakes up, doesn't even remember it at all until he's being wheeled out of the hospital. He's kind of blankly staring up in the clouds in the sky, and all of a sudden he's like, oh my God, like I went through this. And that was just interesting to me, that there was like this delayed remembrance way after, as opposed to the opening eyes and whoever's there, you're like, you're not going to believe where I was.
Right. I'm kind of curious, too, how long was he in the coma for, and then how much time between he woke up from the coma and was discharged? Because that could be weeks or longer, depending on what kind of shape he was in. You're talking about a traumatic brain injury. You're not going to just be in a coma and then go home 2 days later. It doesn't really work that way.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, what the time span was from the time that he was in this coma till he woke up till he remembered this, this occurrence. That's another thing I would be curious to ask him.
And ask him I did. To which Chris replied he was in a coma for 3 days. And once waking up from the coma, he was released from the hospital 5 days later. So, to answer Christine's question, it would have been 8 days since his suicide attempt / NDE, before, while leaving the hospital, he was able to recall all of the events he had experienced. And to that point, I was wondering, so he died, was brought back at some point, obviously, in the hospital and was then in a coma, but how long, not that he has any concept of time when he was dead, but like, how long was he there? Other stories, it's like, I was dead for 7 minutes and then I was back.
Right.
I was having surgery and I died.
Almost stand still during that moment, like during those moments.
Right. So it's like, was he there for a year? If he was dead and then in a coma, was he in the coma while he was with the angels? Well, I guess not, because he says they told him, like, at one point he's back in the clouds and they say, look down, and he sees now the paramedics are there and his friend is outside the car crying and on the phone. So I guess it wasn't that long, but part of me was like, could he have been in a coma and still kind of having some part of this near-death experience elongated? But I guess I just proved to myself probably not.
I think it seemed, the way he was telling the story, it seemed more like it was occurring just at the site of the accident, and then he just didn't remember it until afterwards, which isn't too surprising. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but I've had dreams before where I wake up and I don't remember anything, and then I'm doing something during the day, and I'm like, oh my God, that was the weirdest dream I had last night. And it just, something that I'm doing sparks my memory from the dream, So maybe there was something, I don't even know about, when he's saying he looked up at the clouds. So maybe there's just something that kind of jogged his memory at that point.
Yeah, definitely. That actually happened to me today when I was outside looking at a tree, and I was like, oh, I had the weirdest dream. But yeah, to your point, didn't remember it, didn't think about it, and then all of a sudden just hit me, this flashback of my dream, and I was like, oh, wow, that is weird.
And then, of course, you try to remember it a little while later, and you can't remember anything.
Yeah, I only remembered that one little section, so it wasn't very helpful, but still there. And then, I guess, as we kind of touched on, the main kind of takeaway is the after effect of the near-death experience They are usually associated with a change in personality or an outlook of life. And again, Kenneth Ring came up with a consistent set of values or belief changes that are associated with near-death experiences. They are a greater appreciation for life, higher self-esteem, greater compassion for others, less concern for material wealth, a heightened sense of purpose and understanding, a desire to learn, and an elevated spirituality. So, regardless of what happened and what classic NDE traits were there or not, I would say definitely Chris came out of this with no longer being suicidal, more motivated to help people that are in his situation, a better outlook on life, much more upbeat. So his view on God and spirituality and religion changed. So throughout it all, he definitely ended up with that main stamp, which is that life-changing outlook.
Right. I think people need to understand whether or not they believe that did it truly happen? Did he have an NDE? Is this paranormal? Like, it's kind of irrelevant because it's how your perspective changed because of the experience. So if it happened or not, who cares? But the fact is that whatever they believed happened to them, whether it was truly real or not, changed the way that they're living their life today. So you can't fight that because you can see, I don't know him personally, but if he was truly changed by the experience and now is living a completely different lifestyle, the people around him should be able to see how he was before versus how he was after, and it should be a shocking difference,
Right, definitely. And I think to go from thinking my life is worthless, I'm worth nothing, no one likes me, it's worth ending it, to flip that completely to life is great, God loves everyone, God loves me, I've got to help other people, I'm going to tell them life is worth living. That's definitely a 180 change on his outlook on even himself, his own self-esteem, his worth. He wrote a book about it. He's spreading his story, spreading positivity, so he definitely changed.
What did you think about the fact that he, in a lot of the stories that I hear, people will ask, they're not asked actually, they're just told, you're going back now, and they basically say, no, I don't want to go back, I like it here, But for him, they asked him, and he said, yeah, I want to go back. Like, he was all right about going back. But I feel like many NDE stories that I've heard, they kind of are more strong-armed about going back, and he seemed like he had a little bit more free will to choose. Like he said one time, it's not like he's a robot. He can choose whether or not he wants to go back, and he chose to come back.
Yeah, when he told me the story initially, he said, they asked me, and I immediately said, I want to go back. So then when we were done, he was done telling the story, I asked him directly. I was like, usually people have such a hard time because they're in this feeling of peace, love. It just, some people have said they feel like that's the real reality. They feel alive there, and here is more of like a dream or a simulation. And it's just this, whatever the feeling is over there, it's so hard to leave. So again, that's another trait that sort of goes against the norm. And it is interesting because for a guy who is so willing to throw away his life, the fact that he was so quick to be like, no, I will go back.
Yeah, if you were dealing with this depression and now you're in this utopia and then you're trying to jump backwards to the hell.
Right, yeah.
The hell that was.
Yeah, it's definitely...
It's hard to grasp.
Yeah, it's unexpected. And maybe that video of just people walking by was enough to make him, and them repeatedly saying, you're worth it, you're going to do things. Maybe that was all he needed to hear. So for him, it was easy to jump back.
Yeah, he just maybe needed the support of people believing in him.
Right.
It seems like his family life was in shambles. He didn't have a support system so much. So if he feels like he can get a support system from the spirit world, then that's enough to push him forward.
Yeah, it sounds like his faith became definitely a driving force in his life. And one thing that also is interesting and continued moving forward, Daniel Brinkley, who was a guest on the first NDE episode, said he came back with knowledge that was sort of prophetic, and some of these prophecies supposedly came to pass, but that was where it ended. He was not clairvoyant afterwards or anything like that. But Chris says, since returning, he still can hear, he does not see, but he can hear these two angels talking to him, and they teach him things, and they tell him about chakras. They got him to go online and look up a near-death experience and find out that, other people have had them, and these are the commonalities, and that's what got him to write his book. What do you make of his sort of continued dialogue with these two angels?
I struggled with this one a little bit because when it's especially the chakras. That's the thing that I thought was a little strange, because if you go into the spirit world and they are trying to teach you. The term chakras is more of, and I mean, I'm no expert on this, but I feel like it's more of a Hinduism, Buddhism, like it's tied to that religion.
Right.
And not that this was it wasn't tied to any religion, his near-death experience, but it's just strange that they would call it that instead of saying, like, you have energy in different areas of your body, or, you know, like the fact that they went ahead, and maybe he then, after he learned about chakras, he gave the name chakras, but I wonder if initially, like if they were teaching him something, I would think they would refer to it more of a description rather than using a terminology like that.
Right.
So, I mean, that's another question I have. Did they call it chakras, or did you call it chakras after you learned about it? And did they maybe teach you about energy areas in your body and how to use them as tools? And then as you were researching it, you found that term and like kind of jumped onto it. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's just weird to me that they tied it to that immediately, because I can't imagine it's just so specific to those religions for it to cross over now into just like this kind of broad sense.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it does make sense. I understand exactly what you're saying. And I definitely feel like there are skeptics out there who will say he had a brain injury, he's hearing voices, they're not real, which is like a very easy way to negate anything he says. But once again, like we're not in his head, we don't know. We'll give him the benefit of the doubt on that front. A question I'd like to ask you, due to your science and medical background, is, and I asked this to everyone that told us their NDE, what are your thoughts on a near-death experience versus what a lot of people will say? It's basically you're running out of oxygen, your eyes are losing focus, which is the tunnel of light, or you're on drugs and painkillers, which is why you have a hallucination. Like, where do you draw a distinction between, or do you, of this is a biological or chemical occurrence versus, no, these people are leaving their body and going somewhere?
Right. See, for me, with the NDEs that I read, the ones that are most believable are ones that have actually documented death. So, like, if you're telling me, like, when I heard Brinkley's story, and he was dead for a certain period of time, and then he woke up in the morgue, like, he had a documented period of time where he was physically proclaimed dead. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I feel like in situations like that, there's no explanation. Or I read stories where they were able to match the description of what was going on in the room at the same time as they were brain dead, or, you know, their heart wasn't pumping anymore. However, they were using the criteria of, you know, claiming that they were dead. Those stories are a little bit more, those ones get me more. For something like this, where we are talking about someone who, I don't know whether or not he was proclaimed dead. We'll find that out.
And just a reminder, Chris did later confirm that he was declared medically dead before he slipped into a coma.
But is it possible that it's more of like a lucid dream, or some kind of, like you're saying, a hallucination, brain chemistry? I think a lot of these are that. I think there are NDEs, but I think they're rarer than a lot of the stories that we hear. I think most of the stories that we hear are just the fact that your body, not that you're not experiencing something phenomenal, but I don't know that you're actually like, I don't know that it's paranormal as much.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I fight with myself about that, though. Like, even as I'm saying it out loud, I'm like, do I really believe that? I don't know. Do I?
Yeah,
I can't tell you for sure.
Like all things, it's so hard because unless you're experiencing it, it's hard to know if someone else, you know, they'll swear up and down like, no, I was standing in front of this being of light and they hugged me and it was this. And it's like, maybe, but I don't know, but maybe. But it's like, unless you can experience it, you will never really be able to definitively say like, yes, your soul left your body, you did go to hell, then you were shot up to heaven, and then a beetle,
right.
9-foot beetle told you were great. It's like, unless you live through it, you'll never really know. So all you and I can do is sort of guess.
Well, and that's why people are a little hesitant to tell their stories, because they're putting it out there and having people like us sitting here talking about like, well, was it true? Did he believe it? Did this happen or not? So I give him credit for sharing the story just generally, but it's also hard to say because like knowing medicine and knowing what happens with traumatic brain injuries specifically, like a lot of the NDEs, they're more of their heart stopped versus their brain
right.
was injured. So when you're talking about brain injury, there's so much that goes on in the brain. It's so complex that they don't even know really what's going on. And then you get into the whole consciousness. Like, what is consciousness? You know, are we separate from our consciousness? Like, you can go down the rabbit hole real fast.
Yeah.
So I guess with the brain injury, and when you're saying medically, so is he hypoxic and he has a lack of oxygen to his brain? Yes, some of that might cause hallucinations, but not to the point, like some of the things that they explain during the experience. It's something beyond just a chemical component, I think. But like, where do you draw the line? That's where it's a little fuzzy.
Yeah, definitely. And again, like when so many people have the same things, that's when I'm always like, something's going on. You know, like a life review. I think it's weird that you're like, well, you're running out of whatever. You didn't have enough blood. Your heart stopped pumping. So somebody showed you every moment of your whole life and explained the good and the bad. And then you came back and changed your whole life. Like, that's like, I get like, okay, you're losing your vision. You think you're in a tunnel. Like some of it I could see being biological, but some of it, and the fact that people from every culture all over the world report the same things, that's when I'm always like, okay, something's up.
And when you look through it, I mean, even the scientists, they can explain out some of it, but some of it they don't have explanations for. So if you can't explain everything with science, then that you're admitting that there's something more to it. You're not saying that it's paranormal, but you're definitely saying that there's more to the explanation that you just don't know. They haven't proven. But I mean, now we're talking about the digital age, and people have access to these stories and they hear them, and you know, there's all these paranormal shows on TV. So for me, what I love to do is to go back to stories like before all this, and you can find the similarities in these stories from years and years ago, and they still had them, and they've reported them without ever knowing someone else that had that experience. That's what gives me a little bit more validity to it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like the chicken or the egg. It's like if everybody's heard, for example, like the angels, if everybody says, oh yeah, an angel, he was wearing all white and he had a halo and little wings, that's when it's like, okay, that's what you heard and saw, drawings of angels, that's what it's supposed to be, as opposed to if nobody knew those commonalities, they still describe the same thing. To your point, that's when you're like, okay, something's going on and you're all experiencing it without sharing that information.
Exactly. One other kind of random thing, he did briefly discuss having epilepsy. And I know that there's certain cases, and I'm, again, not trying to discredit him at all. I don't know anything about his story, but there are cases of like schizophrenia associated with epilepsy. And I wonder if that was ever, because he said he decided to heal himself. He didn't go back to the doctor. So like, I don't know, was he ever checked out to see, is there damage that's irreparable? You know, like, maybe that would give more information about what happened if they could see his brain and they said, nope, you healed 100%, everything looks perfect, and yet he's still hearing these spirits, these angels. That would be, I'd be like, oh wow, you know, that's proof, that's more proof. But if they go in and they do a scan and they see that he has this damage that was done that was never, you know, never healed properly, then I feel like it gives you it gives you an area of gray that you can kind of fight the story.
Right, yeah, it definitely would cast some doubt on everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. Is there anything else you'd like to add or cover we have not yet spoken of?
Not necessarily from this story, just generally with these NDEs. When people come out with them, I think it all goes back to what they do after the fact that really makes me a believer or not. So like when I heard Daniel Brinkley, and he went ahead and he sat bedside with all these dying people and decided to volunteer his life to patients on hospice. Like, if you didn't have something serious happen to you, you know, I can't imagine that you'd make a life change like that. Or even with Howard, I can't remember, what is the Storm, right?
Yep.
He ended up becoming a minister, you know. So, like, I kind of follow their stories afterwards because they don't just change for a minute, you know. They change their lives forever if they're being truthful, I think. But, like, if they're trying to fight for the fame or fight for the, like, oh, let me go get a reality show and start chasing ghosts outside because I had an NDE, like, you know, that's going to tell a lot from the experience. And I'm not talking about his story. I'm just saying in general. Like, it's something to either add to your, I don't know how to explain it, to basically add to the proof, if you want to call it that, is just how did they change. And you can still fight that it wasn't real, but if they did make that change, then it was real to them, and there's no one that could really fight that.
Right, yeah, whether or not there's no fact that they met God or they went through everything, but the fact that cannot be refuted is, to your point, their life veered suddenly and they've changed. And also, to your point, they usually change for the good. Howard Storm quit his job, became a minister, once again found faith. Chris found faith and is reaching out and trying to help suicidal people. Danyan, as you said, went to hospice for veterans, started his own hospice group and everything. So even though, they do write books, they do share their story, and I think that's a big part of it too, just to let other people that have gone through it know you're not alone, and just to share what they went through. But yeah, nobody is really trying to like cash in like a dirty, grimy way, like you're saying, with a reality show, or like come to my house and give me $1,000 and I'll kind of tell you what happened or anything like that. They genuinely, at their core, seem to have a metamorphosis for the better. So yeah, regardless if the NDE was real or not, the change is definitely real.
Right, and they're living it out. So like you can see in their actions. And it's the same thing, I don't know if this is so stupid, but it's something I'm thinking of. So like people right now with the whole COVID thing, they want to pretend like, I'm helping people, but like they're not really, but they're taking pictures of themselves like in their masks and like looking really important, but they're not frontline workers at all. And then meanwhile, you have the frontline workers that they don't need the credit because they know what they're doing. So like in a similar way, like these people, they know in their hearts that the changes that they're making are helping people. So like they don't need to publicize it from, stand on the rooftops like, I'm helping people. They know they are, and they're doing it through their actions, not necessarily through like portraying it in this way and being fake about it. It's all about the way that they're acting.
Right, yeah.
You can see it.
They're doing it to help rather than for glory or fame or recognition.
Right.
They just have pure motives, I guess is a way to say it.
And I mean, years. This one is a younger person, this particular story that we're talking about right now. But the other two, they've been living this, talking about this story and living the life for how many years after their near-death experience. If they were going to drop the story, it would have happened by now. How long can they hold up? Right. Pretending. Like at some point you're going to crack, like, oh shoot, I definitely told someone else a different story. You can't keep track of it if it's not real.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's harder to remember made up stuff, and they've definitely been very consistent. Right. So
I think time will tell, really.
Ain't that the truth? On that note, I want to thank you for jumping on the show, filling in, and co-hosting. You did a fantastic job.
It was fun. Thank you.
And time will tell in the case of Chris Batts as well. Again, it is not for us. We're not here to try to decide if what Chris or anyone who's shared a story on our podcast, if it was real or not real. We'll leave that up to you. We're just here to have a discussion, talk about it, analyze it from all angles, all sides. And we would not be able to do that without people coming forward, being open enough, trusting us, and having the willingness to share their stories on such a public platform. So we just want to give, once again, a huge thanks to Chris for not only reaching out, but sharing his story, a very personal story. So one last big thank you to Chris Batts, as well as a big thank you to Christine for coming on, filling in, and doing a fantastic job co-hosting the show.
The Brothers Mysterium.
Once again, a big thank you to our guest, Chris Batts. If you want his book, it is available on Amazon and is titled Boom, The Life and Times of a Suicide Near-Death Experiencer. Shout out to our voice talent on this episode, Jessica and Ashley. Music from this episode comes from purpleplanet.com, as well as the song Sad Trio by Kevin MacLeod, and the church music is from COAG Music. If you'd like to use their music, you can email them at coagmusic@yahoo.com. Our theme song is, of course, by the band The Never Grin. I'll ask one more time for you to please rate and review the podcast on whatever podcast provider you use or however you are currently listening to it. If you want to get in touch with the Brothers Mysterium, you can do so via social media. Facebook.com/The Brothers Mysterium, at Mysterium Bros on Twitter and Instagram, and our email address is thebrothersmysterium@gmail.com. And as always, I'd like to thank you for listening to us.